No Small Endeavor is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations. This is No Small Endeavor. I'm Lee C. Camp. You're listening to our unabridged interview with Kristin Neff. Professor Kristin Neff is a professor of educational psychology at UT Austin. She has done a lot of remarkable work on practices of kindness to oneself, self-compassion, compassion to and with oneself. Found this a remarkable interview. Glad to be releasing it again as a best of episode because it's one of those that I've gone back and listened to more than once and have recommended to quite a number of people, including one or two of my sons. Self-compassion. Hope you find this helpful. A few weeks ago, our manager sent me a new sponsor proposal by a company called Quince. So I dutifully went to check out their website. And before I knew it, I had already made my first purchase. My lovely wife, Laura, had told me I was embarrassing her the way I was dressed when going to the Y. So I found the perfect navy performance tech shorts that would have cost me 2 to 3 times more at the store where I had considered getting some gym wear. And now I'm so pleased. I'm waiting on my new summer shirt to come in, along with some European linen drawstring shorts. Quince has all the things we actually want to wear, like organic cotton silk polos, those European linen beach shorts, and comfortable pants that work for everything, from backyard hangs to nice dinners. Plus, they have high ethical commitments in manufacturing practices, a commitment of which I'm especially fond. And yes, the good stuff keeps coming. Everything with Quince is priced 50 to 80% less than what you'd find at similar brands. So yes, I am a new fan of Quince. You can elevate your closet with Quince. Go to quince.com/endeavor for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's Quince, QUINCE.com/endeavor to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/endeavor. Enjoy. Kristin Neff received her doctorate from the University of California at Berkeley, is currently an associate professor of educational psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. Kristin is a pioneer in the field of self-compassion research. In addition to writing numerous academic articles on the topic, she's also the author of the book Self-Compassion, The Proven Power of Being Kind to Yourself, and most recently, Fierce Self-Compassion, How Women Can Harness Kindness to Speak Up, Claim Their Power, and Thrive. Welcome, Kristin.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us so much. I always like it when someone can be a little bit of a contrarian. And so you're somewhat of a contrarian to the popular pop culture celebration of self-esteem, it seems.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. Well, it's not just me. It's really the whole field of psychology. I'm not a lone voice in this. So if you define self-esteem as a positive judgment of worth, the feeling that I'm a good person versus a bad person, there's no problem with having self-esteem. It's definitely better to have self-esteem than to hate yourself. The whole problem is, how do you get your high self-esteem, right? And so what we know in psychology, there's so many research studies that show a lot of people get it in a pretty unhealthy way, like feeling special and above average, right? It's not okay to be average, which means we always have to be better than others, which means we're always like comparing ourselves to others, which means, we might get jealous, or we might bully people, or, other people make us feel insecure, so we feel less connected to them. But probably the biggest problem with self-esteem is that it tends to be contingent. In other words, we only feel good about ourselves when we succeed, or when we look the way we want to look, or when people like us. But what happens when things don't go our way? Self-esteem's a fair weather friend, right? It's there for us at the good times, but it deserts us when times get tough. Right? And that was my idea about self-compassion, is more of a stable, unconditional friend.
Yeah. I always find it also fascinating when things trotted out in good intention end up having unanticipated ill consequences. So you talk a number of times about the ways in which the focus upon self-esteem actually might be underwriting narcissism and even bullying. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at bullying, for instance, then that can be physical aggression, or it can be like spreading rumors, gossip about people. We know that one of the reasons early adolescents start to bully is to raise their self-esteem, right? They don't have a lot to go on. So one way they feel superior in their own mind is by picking on other people, putting other people down. And and it's not just adolescents. I mean, if you look at prejudice, for instance, now, prejudice is complex, but at least one of the things that's going into it is I want to feel that my racial, religious, ethnic, whatever group is superior to others. And that's one of the reasons I engage in prejudice, because it boosts my sense of self-esteem. Um, and narcissism, what happens with narcissism is when people, they can't, they're so invested in their high self-esteem that they start distorting reality, right? And they can't even admit the slightest flaw, or they can't admit that they've made a mistake or anything that at all threatens their ego. They become very, very defensive in order to protect that high self-esteem, right? So in other words, the need to feel good and discomfort with realizing that, some things we aren't so good at. It's kind of part of being human. It can really create an unhealthy dynamic. Perfectionism is another problem with it. We have to be perfect at everything. It's not okay. It's the students getting an A- who come to me in office hours to talk about the grade, not those getting the B+. So
I was definitely one of those that was perfectionistic, and especially around academic stuff. And I've laughed through the years about this one story in fourth grade where I got my first B in my social studies class in fourth grade, and I was so upset and so distraught about it that weepy even, I think. That at the end of the day, my social studies teacher came to me and said, "Oh, I made a mistake. You actually made an A." And I thought, "Oh no, that either she did make a mistake, or much worse would be if she were so codependent as to help me deal with my perfectionism." But
right.
So you're instead promoting self-compassion. You've even called yourself a self-compassion evangelist. So tell us a little bit about how this approach is different.
Yeah, and I call myself an evangelist because, back when I started researching it about almost 20 years now, it wasn't very popular, the concept. People hadn't really written about it. So I kind of took it on myself to spread the good word, so to speak, because my research was showing that it was such a powerful source of well-being. So self-compassion, it's also a sense of self-worth, but it's not a judgment or an evaluation that one is good versus bad. It's simply, compassion, concern with the alleviation of suffering. It's just caring about yourself, right? Your sense of worth comes from the fact that you're a human being like all other human beings, as precious as any other. And so self-compassion is really about supporting oneself, being there for oneself when times are difficult. And by the way, because it's compassion, right, is particular to the context of suffering. Actually, in the Latin, passion means to suffer, con means with. So it's a way of being with yourself in times of suffering, whether that's because you failed or made a mistake or feeling inadequate in some way, or something like the pandemic, or, you have a health condition or something's going on in your life that's very difficult. It's a way of relating to yourself in times of suffering with kindness, care, and connection. It's not self-pity. It's not like, woe is me. It's just recognizing, hey, life is difficult for everyone. I'm a human being like all other human beings. And the research is just phenomenally powerful in terms of showing that if you can relate to your difficulties with compassion as opposed to harsh judgment or shame or feelings of isolation, it makes us much stronger and healthier mentally and physically, actually.
Yeah, I want to come back and talk about some of those studies in a moment. But before we go there, you've talked about at least 3 different components of self-compassion, and one being just kind of kindness to ourselves. So could you tell us a little bit more about that one?
Right, yeah. So you might say the emotional tone of compassion is one of warmth and kindness, right? As opposed to being harsh or judgmental, the way actually most of us are. Most of us tend not to be kind to ourselves, especially when we've made a mistake. So just as compassion for a friend means you're kind and warm and supportive to that friend, we're also kind and warm and supportive to ourselves. but it's more than kindness alone. The reason it's compassion and not just kindness, the reason I didn't just call it self-kindness is because there's two other elements. One is actually mindfulness. So I actually learned about self-compassion as part of my mindfulness meditation practice. That's where I learned about it. In the Buddhist tradition, it makes absolutely no sense to be compassionate to others, but not yourself, because of course the self and the other are interconnected, right? And so in order to be present, or in order to give ourselves compassion for suffering, we need to be able to be present with it. In other words, if we ignored it, if we pretend it's not there, or we just stiff upper lip it, or on the other hand, if we're lost in it, if we have no perspective, we're just like wallowing in it, we actually can't have compassion. And so mindfulness, kind of the awareness of, wow, I'm really having a hard time right now. Is there anything I can do to help? In order to ask that question, we actually need to have some mindful awareness of our pain. And so that's really the first step. And then so you're mindful of your pain, you're kind to yourself because it hurts, basically. And then really important, a sense of interconnectedness, of common humanity, I call it. So what's the difference between pity and compassion, right? So if I pity you, I'm looking down on you, I'm feeling sorry for you. Or if I'm involved in self-pity, I'm feeling sorry for myself. Pity is different than compassion. So compassion is like, hey, I've been there. There's an inherent sense of connectedness, of humanity in the experience. And the same thing with self-compassion. It's not poor me. It's really framing our experience in light of the shared human experience. Okay, everyone's imperfect. Everyone struggles. Some people struggle more than others. Yes, it doesn't deny that. But nonetheless, an intrinsic part of being human is the right to compassion from this perspective, anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Two things come to mind there. One, or if you give some commentary on this, in the Christian tradition, you've got Jesus saying the two greatest commandments are, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as you love yourself.
Yes.
And so that second commandment presumes one has a capacity to rightly love oneself. But I think oftentimes in the Christian tradition, we're so fearful of selfishness.
Yes.
That we haven't taught. I don't think we've done a sufficient job of teaching this self-compassion that you're pointing to. But any observations about that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, if the commandment had been written differently, like love your neighbors as you love yourself, you wouldn't have any friends. In the sense that, right?
Oh,
so
yeah.
you do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Right.
But actually, if you just extrapolate how you treat yourself to others, could you imagine if you told your best friend the things you say to yourself? I mean, they would slam the door in your face, probably, right?
Yeah.
So, and so this idea, it's really a shame, this idea that self-compassion is selfish, because what we know is the more compassion flows inward, the more it can flow outward, right? And especially if you put it like in a Christian context, if you felt like for some reason that you were the only source of your compassion and you could only generate maybe 5 units, well, yeah, then maybe if I gave 3 to myself, I'd only have 2 left over for you. Yeah. But really, the idea is you're tapping into this larger compassion. If you're a Christian, you can think of it as God's love or Jesus's love. In other words, you aren't like creating it. You're tapping into this field of compassion, which is actually much bigger than yourself. And so when you do that, what happens is when you allow that compassion to flow inward, when you allow yourself to receive warmth and kindness and support and care, what it means is you actually have more resources available to give to others. And really importantly, to give to others without burning out. Because what happens is when giving is just one way, and we just run ourselves ragged, caring for others all the time, and we don't care for ourselves, including we don't care for the pain of caring for others, right? Then what happens is we inevitably start to burn out. But when you can be kind and warm and supportive toward yourself, and the research is very clear on this, you reduce burnout and you increase your ability to be satisfied with being a caregiver as opposed to having exhaustion drain you. And it's more sustainable over time.
Yeah. You've raised this issue of self-pity.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about the ways in which self-pity might be one potential side effect of self-esteem? And then a little bit more about how self-compassion undercuts or subverts self-pity?
Yeah, so it really is about connectedness, right? And again, that's one of the problems with self-esteem is that, there are different sources of self-esteem. Actually, self-compassion, you might say, is a healthy source of self-esteem. It's
Mm,
like unconditional. It's not personal,
right.
but self-esteem is often very personal. The focus is really on the individual, especially as distinct from others, in comparison to others, better than
Mm,
others, special from others, right? And that focus on the individual self, well, in the good times, maybe you've got some high self-esteem, but when things aren't so good, it can lead to shame. It can lead to harsh self-criticism. It can lead to self-pity, like woe is me, right? When we forget that actually, well, not only does everyone suffer, actually a lot of people suffer a lot more worse than we're suffering right now. But we forget that when we lose our mindfulness and we're just kind
right.
of lost in our negative feelings. And so what self-compassion does is by having this larger frame, this frame of interconnectedness, this frame of community, you might say, then that means we can include ourselves in the circle of compassion. We don't think we're more important than others, but we also don't think we're less important than others.
Yeah.
In other words, we're a human being like all of the others. Everyone is worthy of warm, compassionate, caring response.
I did. Some years ago, I learned a very helpful meditation exercise that pointed directly to what you're talking about here from Pema Chodron, I think is how you pronounce her
Uh-huh.
name,
Mhm.
in her book, When Things Fall Apart.
Yes.
And Tonglen, I think, is the name of the
Yes.
meditation exercise. Yeah. And so it was fascinating to me the way this worked. And as as I understood what she was saying, first I should note that I was in a context, a personal moment in which my wife and I were very concerned about the health of one of our sons, and
Oh.
he was in a very distressing situation, and we did, fear even potentially for his life.
Mm,
And I found myself too often falling prey to self pity around that.
mhm.
And so, as I understood her meditation practice, it was that she points to this sort of common psychological tendency that we have to want to avoid our pain, and
Yes.
so we kind of psychologically turn away from our pain.
Yes.
And she counsels, as one is meditating and you breathe in, let the pain hit you and feel the pain, to be
Right.
present to the pain. And then as you breathe out, to kind of have this sense of acceptance and this sense of a desire for peace for oneself and compassion with oneself. And
Yes.
then the turn that was so helpful was that then you began to take attention to other people who have that same sort of pain,
Yes.
and then let their pain hit you. And the second move of the meditation,
Mhm.
and then as you breathe out, to have a desire for compassion for all of those people. And
Mm.
as I practiced that, it was amazing to me the way in which my temptation, that moment in which I would be tempted to self-pity, all of a sudden became a mechanism for solidarity with others
Yes.
rather than focusing on myself. It was a terribly helpful sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. So just recognizing interconnection. So I'll tell you a story related to that. So my son's autistic, right?
Mm,
So I certainly learned a lot raising him, and my self compassion practice came in handy. And I remember one time, so I was at a park with him, and there were the kids at the playground. It was a beautiful day. They were playing. Kids were playing with each other, interacting with their parents. And here's little Rowan. At that point, he was really lost in his autism, and he was just banging. He was sitting on the slide, banging it, entranced by the sound, totally absorbed by
mm,
the sound, not interacting with me or the other kids. And I started to fall into self pity. Why me? It's not the plan I signed up for, and like feeling sorry for myself. But because of my
yeah,
self-compassion practice, I remembered common humanity. And I said, because I was kind of unconsciously assuming that all these parents had these perfect, unproblematic relationships with their
yeah,
kids. And I caught myself and I said, Kristen, really? I mean, yeah, maybe it's not autism, but surely all of these parents, their kids will have, physical challenges, mental health challenges, or at the very least, every single one of these parents will have some sort of challenge with their kids because that's what it means to be a parent, right? Being a parent is not like
yeah,
problem free. It's you run into challenges and you do your best and you love them the best you can. And so the moment I made that reframe, I went from feeling all isolated and alone to really connected to all those other parents on that
yeah,
playground. And so that's really that's one of the most powerful aspects, one of the most empowering aspects of self compassion is that sense of connectedness with others. You actually, although the word self is there, ironically, you're reducing the focus on the separate self, right? And you're really just
Yeah.
seeing yourself as part of a larger whole.
Yeah. Yeah. And along with that, I began to actually keep a written list of other parents that I would begin to talk to, and realized the deep pain or the deep difficulty or the deep fear that they were having about their own children.
Yes.
And just to make intentional this sort of practice of it doesn't have to be just about me, right?
Yes.
That again, this self-compassion can lead to a shared compassion.
That's right.
Terribly helpful.
That's right. Yeah.
Recently had a conversation with a psychiatrist named Curt Thompson, and he talks a lot about shame and vulnerability. And he also speaks to the kind of both neurological and physiological nature of shame.
Yes.
The negative effects of how shame can change us physiologically.
Mm-hmm.
And you also speak to the physiological damage of being harsh to oneself versus the physiological goods of self-compassion. So can you tell us a little bit more about the sorts of studies that have been done or are being done that point to these things?
Yeah. So what we know is that a lot of this impacts our autonomic nervous system. So for instance, shame and self-criticism, what you're really doing is you're tapping into the body's sympathetic nervous system, or sometimes called the fight, flight, or freeze response, right? So when you think about it, the system comes online whenever we feel threatened. But when the threat is ourselves, like we feel inadequate, or we made some mistake, or we failed at something, we try to get safe by fighting ourselves with self-criticism, or maybe fleeing from ourselves. And the sense of shame is actually that sense of fleeing from the perceived judgment of others, like we withdraw. Or when we get stuck, we freeze, right? That's kind of rumination, when we can't get out of our own mindset. We can keep going over and over it. So first of all, just to say, we shouldn't judge ourselves for this reaction. We're just trying to stay safe, because it's very threatening and scary when we feel inadequate or we failed at something. And so unfortunately, when we're constantly activating our sympathetic nervous system, it increases like cortisol levels, and it can lead to things like heart disease. So what self-compassion does is it actually makes us feel safe a different way. And that's through the care system, which is related to the attachment system, parasympathetic nervous system reaction. So in other words, the way human beings are designed is when we feel cared for, maybe like someone's touching us, or we feel loved, we feel we belong, then our bodies calm down. We start increasing heart rate variability, for instance, and releasing things like oxytocin, which makes us feel safe and connected. So that's actually what self-compassion does. Even though we're doing it with ourselves, our body doesn't really distinguish very clearly. So for instance, we know when we give ourselves compassion, we reduce cortisol and increase heart rate variability. So we're actually literally helping our bodies feel more safe. And that's, for instance, that's one of the reasons self-compassion is linked to more physical health, things like better immune function, because when your body's operating, feeling more safe, it actually functions better and you get sick less often. You sleep better also.
So can you talk a little bit more then about what the suggested interventions might be, or suggested best practices to cultivate this? I mean, you've kind of pointed to some with mindfulness meditation, but what are other sorts of, or kind of, if people are saying, okay, I want to try this, what would be some first steps you might suggest?
So what's really been surprising in my research is that it's easier than I had imagined it would be for people to be self-compassionate. I mean, it's hard to get in the habit of it because we're used to being critical. But the thing is, we already know how to be compassionate. It's not like learning a new skill. We already know how to be compassionate to others. So we already have the template that's fully formed. We really just have to give ourselves permission to use these skills with ourselves. So what you can do is, one very easy thing you do, and actually there's research showing that this helps to dismantle shame, is if you just bring in intentionally the three components of self-compassion. So in other words, you're mindful of the fact that you're hurting, that you're feeling emotional pain. It could also be physical pain, right? This really hurts. It hurts to feel this way. I'm scared, I'm frightened, or, I feel horrible, whatever it is you're feeling. So validating that emotion with mindfulness, remembering that you aren't alone, and again, just reminding yourself, okay, there's nothing wrong with me. feeling this way. This is part of being human. I'm not alone. So just intentionally reminding yourself of your humanity. And then giving yourself some words of kindness. And a very easy thing to do is to think, well, what would I say to a good friend who is in the exact same situation I'm in? What would I say to be kind and supportive to them? We already know that. And the kind of what tone of voice would I use? And then you just turn that inward and say the same thing with yourself. And there's research that shows, for instance, people who did that in the letter writing exercise once a day for 7 days, their happiness increased by 6 months and their depression decreased for 3 months. So 6 months more happiness, 3 months less depression. It's pretty powerful for writing a little letter to yourself.
For just a 1 week exercise.
1 week exercise once a day. So again, it's pretty powerful stuff, and it's not rocket science.
If you're listening to No Small Endeavor, I imagine you just may have an innate curiosity that likes to discover the hidden side of, well, most everything. And in that case, I have just the podcast recommendation for you, Freakonomics Radio. Hosted by the co-author of the best-selling Freakonomics books, Stephen J. Dubner, Freakonomics Radio is the chart-topping, award-winning podcast exploring all the things you thought you knew but didn't, and all the things you never thought you wanted to know, but you do. Each week, you'll hear from some of the most fascinating scholars and big thinkers who tackle big topics, like why the banana is the most interesting fruit in the world, why the best employees can make the worst bosses, and why we dread the miracle of air travel. Need somewhere to start? Check out their episode, Why Is There So Much Fraud in Academia? Ouch. With some of the biggest names in behavioral science accused of faking their results. This episode features the whistleblowers, reformers, and a co-author who got caught up in the chaos. Don't miss out. Listen to Freakonomics Radio wherever you get your podcasts. I've said to myself a number of times through the years that for me, there seems to be a fine line between sadness and self-pity. Where at least I tell myself that sadness to acknowledge my sadness is not only legitimate but important.
Yes.
But it seems like there's a slope sometimes where if I'm not careful, I'll slide off into self-pity. Could you help us think through some about what how does one not slide across over to self-pity out of legitimate sadness?
Yeah, and so that's where these other two components of mindfulness and common humanity come in. So if you think about self-pity, or you might say that feeling moved by your own suffering is the same with compassion and pity. But so what happens with self-pity, the reason we talk about wallowing in self-pity is because we become completely absorbed by the sadness, or we have no perspective. Like it completely colors our mindset. We aren't able to see anything beyond our sadness. We're lost in it. In other words, we've lost our mindfulness. So what mindfulness does is just to be aware that I'm sad. So there's being consumed by sadness, and then there's being aware, oh, I'm feeling really sad. And so as long as there's that little bit of awareness there, we don't become totally consumed by it. We've got some perspective so that we can see more options. And then again, so the other thing that defines self-pity is the sense that I'm all alone, this sense of being cut off from other people. So when you remember, actually, it's not just me, then you're just kind of honoring, yes, sadness is difficult for all human beings, right? But really important, one of the things that mindfulness gives you is it gives you the perspective needed to say, well, what could I do right now that might help? Right. So when we're lost in self-pity, it's like, oh, it's forever and it's always and there's no way out. And we just kind of have this rabbit hole. But when we remember, actually, well, we do have some resources. What might I do that would help in this moment? Then we aren't victim to our self-pity. We actually have more choices and we can take action.
Yeah. What do you think or what have you seen in studies that point to cultural or sociological roots of the tendency of harsh self-judgment?
Right. So there are some cultural differences. So for instance, Anglo-Saxon cultures tend to be more self-critical, kind of that Puritan background. Confucian cultures, so it's not just an East-West thing. Confucian cultures often kind of people are raised with the idea that self-criticism is beneficial. And it's kind of confusing. There's a difference between constructive criticism, which is beneficial, and harsh criticism, like name-calling, belittling, which actually isn't beneficial. So that's a cultural thing. But also gender plays into it. So my new book, you mentioned the title, it's written for women in particular, because women are actually less self-compassionate than men, largely because of gender role socialization. So it doesn't apply to women who are kind of more androgynous, who combine the male and female traditional gender role. But that's because, first of all, we're socialized to be self-sacrificing. I mean, everyone is, but women really are. Women are actually valued for being self-sacrificing. So what that means is women feel less entitled to meet their needs, whereas men actually, they're a little more self-compassionate because, yeah, I deserve some compassion too. But women, because the gender role socialization tells us that we need to be self-sacrificing to be good women. That gets interpreted to mean, we don't meet our own needs. We're always putting others first, right? So it's harder to be compassionate. And then also, women are a little more self-critical, partly because there's a lot of things, but partly because women have less power in society, and anyone who feels more threatened tends to use self-criticism as a way to feel safe. So it's kind of a means of trying to control. Like if I criticize myself, well, maybe I'll make myself look the way I want to look or act the way I want to look, so therefore I'll be safe. Which is kind of, again, remembering that self-criticism is the safety behavior. And so gender, culture plays into it. A lot of factors play into it. Also, the type of family you were raised in also makes a big difference. If your parents were really critical, you're more likely to be self-critical as well. So we come by it honestly, you might say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about, are you familiar with, you talked about the puritanical background, Anglo-Saxon culture. Any sorts of observations about different strands in Christian theology that may help underwrite one versus the other sort of approach to these things?
I think I'd be out of my depth if I tried to answer that question.
Yeah.
So, I know there are different types of Christian theology, and some are a little more punitive than others, but I don't want to generalize.
Okay.
So for instance, like if you look at Catholicism, I think Catholicism can be practiced in a very loving way or in a very punitive way. And I just wouldn't feel comfortable saying, one thing or another.
Yeah. As is the case about most Protestantism as well.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it really just depends on how you interpret it. It's funny. I did teach a group of Catholic nuns once about self-compassion, though. And it's so funny. They totally got it. They just interpreted everything I said through the lens of Jesus. They say, "Oh, of course, I need to let Jesus' love in." And then once they reframed it, they felt uncomfortable with the idea of self-compassion, but they actually felt very comfortable with the idea of Jesus giving them compassion. And they actually were able to use that as the vehicle to give themselves love and support. So,
to receive the compassion of Christ to themselves.
Exactly. That's right.
Yeah.
And so, I really do think that this fits in with whatever theological frame you want to put on it. Or not, depending on how you use your theological frame. Yeah.
Depending on what the larger theological frame is, I suppose.
But if it's really about love, which is supposed to be about love, then it makes total sense.
Yeah. So let's imagine somebody's listening and they say, well, I don't know. That's all sounds so soft and touchy-feely, and they might say, don't we need to be harsh to ourselves to stay motivated? What would you say to that?
Yeah, so the research shows it's the exact opposite. So so first of all, harsh criticism does kind of work as a motivator, just as like with our kids, like harsh punishment and really, scaring our child into doing something, it kind of works. But what we know from the parenting literature is it has lots of unintended consequences. So like if you beat your child or you scare your child or you shame your child, it's going to cause them to have performance anxiety, for instance. And that performance anxiety will actually undermine their ability to achieve their best, right? They'll also become afraid of failure because they know the consequences are so harsh if they do fail. And so fear of failure actually undermines your motivation. So the motivation of self-compassion comes from care, not fear, right? So in other words, we aren't going to be lazy or self-indulgent or give up, because that wouldn't be caring, right? If we care about ourselves, we want to reach our goals. We want to improve. We want to be happy in life. The whole difference. So the research shows is people who are self-compassionate, their standards are just as high, their goals are just as high. The whole difference is what happens when they fail to meet those goals. Well,
Hmm.
instead of shaming themselves, therefore, I'm a failure. And shame is not exactly the most motivating mindset. Maybe
Yeah.
you're familiar with that, right? So when you're full of shame, you can't learn, you can't do anything that kind of like pulls the rug out from underneath yourself. So what self-compassionate people do, because it's okay to fail, that means they're more able to learn from their failure. Oh, okay, failure, that's part of life. That's part of being human. That's how I learn. And so because of that, they have more of a learning orientation. They have a growth mindset, which means they're able to learn from their failure. They're less likely to be afraid of failure, and they're more likely to try again when they do fail. So again, it's much more effective way to motivate yourself, and it's more sustainable in the long run. So it uses encouragement, constructive criticism, as opposed to name
Yeah.
calling and belittling.
Yeah. I've read in some of Brene Brown's work where she makes this distinction that I find helpful in saying that if you take the common distinction between shame and guilt, that shame is a judgment, a negative judgment about the self as such,
Yes.
and guilt is a judgment about a behavior vis-a-vis some norm or standard.
Th-
And that then shame, she says, is highly correlated with things like addiction,
yes.
bullying, inability to meet one's goals, and so forth. Whereas guilt, a highly developed notion of guilt, actually helps you grow.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that seems to correlate with what you're getting at.
Yeah. So they have a way statistically to, because they kind of overlap, shame and guilt. So they look at shame-free guilt and guilt-free shame. So you kind of separate them out.
Huh.
And what we know is self-compassion is negatively linked to shame, and positively linked to guilt. In other words, the guilt that doesn't have the shame component, because it's actually healthy to feel guilty if you're saying, "Okay, I did it. I take responsibility. What can I do to fix the situation?" So self-compassion actually it enhances people's ability to own up to their mistakes and to try
Yeah.
to repair them. Like people say sorry more often if you're
Hmm.
self-compassionate, because you
Yeah.
can admit it. Okay, I'm so sorry. What can
Right.
I do to fix things?
I know certainly personally for myself that the more I learned to identify shame in myself, that like you just said, the more quickly I was actually able to apologize when I needed to. And
Yes.
moreover, I even learned that I was able to start seeking out critique. If I knew somebody who's really good in a field
Yes.
or good at some particular skill that I want to grow in, all of a sudden I had this capacity that I didn't have when I was younger to say, tell me what I'm doing well here and tell me what I could do better on, and help me figure out how to do better on this. And that became easy rather than a thing of any sort of critique became this sort of devastating thing about myself.
Right. And so that's the difference between self-esteem and self-compassion right there,
Mm,
right? So self-esteem, if you think it's going to be an ego blow, that admitting that you aren't perfect or that someone's better than you at something
yeah.
is going to, harm your self-esteem, you aren't going to do it. But with self-compassion, it's just like, oh, I just want myself to be as well as possible and to, grow and heal. Then it's all good, right? You don't take it so personally. It actually is motivation to try to improve.
Any other particular ways that stand out in your own life experience of ways you've seen this help you grow as a human being, or
Uh,
key moments in your story?
yeah, absolutely. Well, it's funny. My last book, I talk a lot about anger, right?
Hmm.
And I've always kind of struggled with anger. The way I'm wired is I kind of tend to be a slightly reactive person. I wish I could. I like to joke. Thank goodness I'm a self-compassion teacher, not a mindfulness teacher, because I'm just it's just whatever the way I'm wired. And for years and years, I would after with my self-compassion practice, I was able to accept my anger. And again, I'm really good at apologizing. I didn't judge myself. I used to judge myself for it, but I moved out of that. But it actually started, I think with time, the practice started really getting more mature, and that I realized that actually the energy that was driving my anger was the same energy that's actually driven me to achieve so much in my life. Right. That's kind of that fierce self-compassion I talked about. I have a lot of fierceness, but that's just part of my nature. I have a lot of this fierce energy, kind of go-getter energy. Also really stand up to, injustice, or if I think someone's crossing my boundaries, I really stand up. And so, yes, we want to have balance. And of course, it's not good to like yell at people or make it personal. But through the self-compassion, I actually started realizing that this is a positive, something that needs to be harnessed, especially when it's harnessed for good. When the anger is harnessed for alleviating suffering, then it's actually a form of self-compassion. And so I think that's one place this path has led me, starting to see things that I used to see as a negative. I can actually now see the positive aspects of it. So
that's remarkable, because that reminds me, we've got on our podcast an interview with Vince Gill here in Nashville, and he has a legendary temper. And he was talking about, I was asking him about his temper and about his anger. And he said that he had gone golfing one day with his wife, Amy Grant, and his this new guy that he'd met or was becoming friends with, as I recollect the story, who was a psychologist. And he lost his temper playing golf. And so they started talking about it. And he said for the first time ever, this psychologist or counselor said, well, that anger doesn't surprise me. So when I look at the things you've done and you've accomplished, you've got to have some energy behind that's driven you to do that kind of stuff. And he said, it's just that energy coming out sideways with the anger.
Right.
And he said, once I realized that, it helped him completely reframe that.
That's right.
And then get a better way of handling and navigating that anger.
In my book, I refer to it as yin and yang, which it's like less judgmental, yin and yang. So the yang energy is more that fierce energy, and yin is more the soft energy. And if you're too yin without enough yang, you're going to be complacent. But if you're too young without enough yin, you're going to be aggressive. So it's about trying to find the balance. And the reason another reason I wrote this book for women in particular is because men and women are imbalanced in different ways. The problem with men, the way they're socialized, is they aren't allowed to be tender. Right, they're cut off from that more yin, gentle side, which is actually inhibits their ability to understand their emotions, and it inhibits the ability to have good social relationships. It's a problem that they aren't allowed to be tender. But then women aren't allowed to be fierce, right? People don't like fierce women. They have different types of names for fierce women.
Right.
And that has women be uncomfortable with their anger, and it can also disempower them, right? And so from my point of view, everyone needs to balance and integrate yin and yang. And that's going to come out differently by gender or whoever you are. It's not going to look the same for any one person.
Yeah.
But to be authentic, we need to be able to access both. And so from my point of view, it's a problem if gender role socialization or culture or whatever, any outside force doesn't allow us to be fully authentic and understand all sides of ourselves, then that's going to lead to psychological problems.
What does it look like, you think, then, in either social settings, workplace settings, friendship relationships between men and women, in which those gender stereotypes can be undercut and healthier relating to those realities can occur in both men and women in those relationships or those settings? Right.
So what the research shows, for instance, for women, so unfortunately, you wonder why there's still a glass ceiling. People dislike really competent, powerful women, even though they need to be competent and powerful to get to leadership positions. People assume that a competent, powerful woman isn't nurturing, and people like nurturing women. So they automatically dislike a woman, for instance, who's too yin, who's too nurturing. What the research shows, though, is as long as you display both sides, as long as you also say, oh, how are your kids? Or like show something kind of more yin, more soft, more tender, then people don't dislike strong, powerful women. And so with men, it's with men, they don't dislike men for being tender necessarily, but it certainly doesn't hurt them if they also display that side, right? And this work showing that, again, gives them more emotional intelligence. So I think really the way to work with it is just to realize that we all have these two sides of ourselves, and to actually consciously ask, okay, am I tapping into both sides, right? Am I being too soft Am I being too complacent? Right? Am I worrying too much about how people like me, for instance? Then maybe I need to draw my boundaries a little firmer. Maybe I need to speak up a little more, right? Or alternatively, like for instance, sometimes when I'm angry, I forget my yin side, and I've got to like, oh, okay, that's right. Remember, say something that shows you care about that person. I've got to remind myself. So it really is just a matter of balance, and it's something we just have to. And here's the thing: we're going to get it wrong. That's also where self-compassion comes in.
Right.
We're going to get it wrong. We're going to fall off. We're going to get off balance. But then by being self-compassionate, it rebalances us. And then we can just try again. One of my favorite quotes is, the goal of practice is simply to be a compassionate mess. Right? So in other words, we're going to be a mess. We're going to get it wrong. We're going to make mistakes. But if our goal is to be compassionate with that mess, then in a way we've achieved. Right? We've achieved our goal. Yeah. And then not only have we achieved our goal, the more compassionate we are, the more able we are to actually achieve our goals.
We've been talking to Professor Kristin Neff, a professor of educational psychology at the University of Texas at Austin, pioneer in the field of self-compassion research. You can get her newest book, Fierce Self-Compassion: How Women Can Harness Kindness to Speak Up, Claim Their Power, and Thrive, or her earlier book, Self-Compassion: The Proven Power of Being Kind to Yourself. Thank you so much, Professor Neff. It's been a delight to talk to you today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
If you like some of the No Small Endeavor theology specific episodes, we think you might like to check out the Trinity Forum Conversations podcast. Our friends there are all about keeping the Christian intellectual tradition alive, nurturing its new growth, and making it available to everyone. The host, Cherie Harder, leads wide-ranging and diverse conversations with guests like historian Tom Holland, poet Malcolm Guite, the novelist Marilyn Robinson, journalist David Brooks, or podcast host Kate Bowler. These conversations provide a deep engagement with the riches of the Christian intellectual tradition in our time, and Lord knows that's needed right about now. So check out Trinity Forum Conversations wherever you get your podcasts. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriet Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.